Hey everyone! Tonight, we begin with the extraordinary story of a building that was not just stone and arches, but a stage for the soul of an empire. So before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. I'm always fascinated to see who's joining us from across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease gently into tonight's journey together. The year was 80 CE. The air in Rome shimmered with expectation like the breath before applause. On the eastern edge of the city rose a monument so vast, so gleaming, that it seemed less a building and more a declaration carved into the sky, the Flavian amphitheater, which the world would come to call the Colosseum. To the Romans of that day, it was not a ruin, not a relic, but brand new, sharp with marble edges, dazzling white under the Mediterranean sun, and alive with the energy of tens of thousands of citizens surging toward its gates. The arena had taken nearly a decade to build, begun under Emperor Vespasian and completed by his son Titus. It was a monument not only to Roman engineering, but to Roman pride. Vespasian had promised a gift to the people, a gesture of generosity after years of civil war. But generosity in Rome was never simple. It was always laced with politics, always meant to remind citizens who held power and who bestowed gifts. The Colosseum was less a theatre and more a throne of stone built to outlast emperors themselves. Imagine it as it stood on that first morning, an oval of travertine blocks 4 stories high, rising to nearly 50 metres. 80 entrances circled the structure, each marked with carved arches that caught the sunlight. From afar, it seemed to float on rows of perfectly stacked columns. Doric on the ground floor, Ionic, above Corinthian, higher still, as though Rome had decided to compress the entire history of architecture into one immense frame. The marble cladding gleamed so brightly that visitors squinted against the glare shielding their eyes, as if looking into the face of a god. 50,000 citizens surged toward its gates that day. The crowd was a living map of Roman society. Senators in their purple-trimmed togas swept through the reserved entrances that led directly to the best seats. Knights the equestrian class filed in with slightly less pomp, but equal pride. Merchants, artisans, freedmen, and slaves poured in through the outer stairways, climbing to the higher tiers where the view was distant, but the price of admission, free bread, free spectacle, was impossible to resist. The hum of voices rose like the sea, each entrance funneling the people of Rome into the belly of their new colossus. Inside, the marvel was greater still. The seats, carved of gleaming marble, fanned upward in a perfect ellipse, their angles so carefully calculated that even the humblest man in the highest row could see the arena floor. Canopies of canvas stretched overhead, rigged by sailors from the imperial fleet, shading the audience from the merciless sun. Vendors circulated with bread olives and cups of sour wine, their shouts mingling with the chatter of anticipation. Beneath the seats ran corridors and staircases so well designed that the entire audience could enter or leave in minutes, a feat of engineering modern stadiums still admire. At the center of it all lay the arena floor, a rectangle of golden sand spread across wooden planks. To the audience, it seemed a blank stage waiting for actors. But beneath those planks was another world entirely, the hypogeum, a labyrinth of tunnels, cages and lifts, where slaves strained at capstans, where animals snarled in the dark, where gladiators waited for their turn to rise into the light. It was a machine of spectacle, hidden below the surface, ready to deliver surprise after surprise into the sight of 50,000 hungry eyes. The inauguration was no casual affair. Emperor Titus had decreed 100 days of games to mark the opening. 100 days, a season of blood. The symbolism was clear. The Colosseum was not only Rome's gift to its people, but a promise that the empire itself had resources without end. Food, animals, men, even death itself could be commanded to appear in endless supply. On that first day, the crowd roared as the emperor himself appeared, draped in robes of white and purple, his presence shimmering in the midday light. To the Romans, the emperor was not simply a man. He was the sun around which their world revolved. When Titus raised his hand, silence fell. When he lowered it, the spectacle began. First came the parade gladiators in gleaming helmets and polished armour marched across the sand, their weapons raised in salute. Ave Caesar, they cried, voices rolling like thunder. Those who are about to die salute you. The crowd answered with a roar that shook the stones. Some of these men were slaves, condemned criminals. Others had volunteered, lured by the promise of glory, or at least the slim chance of freedom. To the audience, they were not men at all, but avatars of courage and fear living dice thrown on the table of fate. Then the beasts arrived. Hidden trapdoors groaned open, and suddenly lions leapt into the sunlight, their manes rippling, their roars swallowed by the cheers of the crowd. Bears lumbered out confused by the noise. Ostriches darted madly across the sand until spears found them. To the Romans, these animals were not merely creatures. They were trophies from the empire's farthest corners, living proof that Rome could command the deserts of Africa, the forests of Germania, the rivers of the Nile. To watch them die was to watch Rome display its reach. Blood stained the sand, the air filled with dust, sweat, and the metallic tang of iron. Gladiators clashed shields, splintering swords flashing. Each victory, each death became part of the theatre. When a man fell to his knees, the crowd turned to the emperor. A raised thumb might mean mercy, a lowered thumb death. In that gesture lay the power of life and death, performed not in secret, but under the open sky, witnessed by tens of thousands. Yet beneath the cheers, there was an undertone of awe. The Colosseum itself was the true star of the show. Every arch, every stair, every mechanism seemed to whisper, Rome is eternal. The citizens might have known in some quiet corner of their minds that stone cracks, that time erodes. But on that day under the burning sun, the amphitheater felt like forever. And so the games continued, lions against men, men against men. The sand darkening as the hours passed. At sunset, the crowd poured out through the 80 gates, voices still buzzing with the thrill of what they had seen. Behind them, the Colosseum loomed, its marble glowing orange in the dying light. A monument not only to architecture, but to appetite. Not only to Rome's genius, but to its hunger. The Romans believed they had built something immortal. And in a way, they had. For though the games would one day falter, though earthquakes and looters would gnaw at its bones, the Colosseum would never truly fade. It would endure as ruin, as symbol, as legend. But that is a tale for another night. For now, we leave the arena in its first glory, perfect, untouched, and drenched in the applause of 50,000 voices. The Colosseum's first breath was not measured in stone alone, but in the rhythm of spectacle. When Emperor Titus cut the ribbon, he did not simply open a building. He unleashed a season of wonder and terror, 100 straight days of performances so extravagant that they seemed designed to remind the gods themselves who truly ruled the earth. 100 days. Imagine it. A season in which the sun rose over marble arches, and each morning, 50,000 Romans filed in with expectant hearts, knowing that blood and bread awaited. The amphitheater was not a theatre in the Greek sense, where tragedy sought to uplift the spirit. No, this was Rome's theatre, where tragedy was real, where blood was not imagined but spilled, where actors did not bow at the end of the play, but collapsed lifeless in the sand. Titus knew what he was doing. He had inherited both empire and unfinished amphitheater from his father Vespasian, and the games were his opportunity to bind Rome to him. Rome was weary from civil war, suspicious of emperors who promised more than they delivered. Bread and spectacle were more than entertainment. They were the emperor's handshake with his people, his unspoken promise that he would feed them, thrill them, and distract them from discontent. The games began with processions, parades of power. First came the gladiators in ordered lines, each bearing weapons polished to glint in the sun. Helmets flashed, spears gleamed, and the crowd drank in the sight of men who would soon bleed for their amusement. Behind them came exotic animals dragged in from cages below lions. Roaring elephants, lumbering ostriches, craning their necks in bewilderment. Rome displayed its empire, not on maps, but in the arena, showing its citizens that the corners of the earth had been gathered under one roof, tamed and chained for their pleasure. Morning often began with venationes, the hunts. Men armed with spears, nets and courage squared off against beasts. Sometimes it was one hunter against one lion, a test of agility against raw power. At other times, it was chaos, a dozen archers loosing arrows into a herd of wild animals as the crowd shrieked in delight. Each beast represented both Rome's reach and its dominance over nature. The forests of Germania, the deserts of Africa, the swamps of the Nile, all reduced to theatre on a sandy floor. Then came the executions, brutal and creative. Condemned criminals were thrown to the beasts, their screams drowned by the roars of the crowd. Others were forced to reenact myths, playing roles that ended with their genuine deaths. One man dressed as Orpheus was torn apart by a bear. Another cast as Hercules was crushed beneath the weight of real labour. To Rome, these deaths were not cruelty, but spectacle justice turned into pageantry. By midday, the air was thick with heat and the stench of blood. The sand golden at dawn grew dark as a butcher's floor. Workers rushed across the arena between bouts, raking the surface, sprinkling fresh sand to soak the gore. For the audience, this was normal. For the Colosseum, it was routine, part of the choreography of death. But the true stars of the games were the gladiators. In the afternoon, the crowd's anticipation swelled as pairs stepped forward to fight. They were trained in schools across the empire, hardened men who knew that the arena was both their prison and their stage. Some fought as murmillos, heavy with helmets and broad shields. Others as retiari, agile with nets and tridents. Each style was a performance designed to pit contrasting skills against each other, speed against strength, cunning against brute force. When the clash began, the arena thundered. Swords struck shields, spears darted nets, entangled helmets cracked. The crowd shouted encouragement or jeers, each citizen becoming a silent judge. The roar grew with each blow until finally one man stumbled. Weapon-lost shield dropped. He lifted his arm in plea. The Colosseum hushed. All eyes turned to the emperor. Here in this suspended moment, the emperor's power was distilled. A raised thumb meant life, the gladiator spared to fight another day. A turned thumb meant death. The crowd surging with approval as the victor delivered the final strike. For the gladiator, fate hung not on skill alone, but on the whim of one man, the pulse of a city, the weight of an empire's hunger for blood. But even these spectacles were not enough for Titus. To astonish his people, he ordered something unprecedented. The arena itself flooded. Wooden planks were removed, channels opened, and water poured in until the sand became a shallow sea. Boats were hauled in sailors positioned, and suddenly the Colosseum transformed into a naval battlefield. Rome, in its arrogance, staged war itself as entertainment. Imagine the sight. Galleys colliding beneath the marble arches, oars, flashing men shouting, water spraying into the front rows. Prisoners dressed as Carthaginians or Greeks were forced to play the role of defeated enemies, their deaths staged as Rome's victories replayed in miniature. The absurdity was matched only by the engineering to flood and drain such a vast space required genius, manpower, and money. But Rome did not care. It was enough that the people gasped, that their faith in the empire's power deepened. Day after day, for 100 days, this cycle continued. Hunts, executions, gladiators, naval battles, each more elaborate than the last. Titus spared no expense. Bread was handed out freely, wine flowed, no citizen left hungry or unamused. It was spectacle as glue binding a fractured people to their ruler with shared awe and horror. And all the while, the Colosseum itself became part of the show. Its arches framed the drama. Its marble reflected the sunlight. Its underground machinery revealed wonders at the pull of a lever. The building was not simply a container for spectacle, it was the spectacle. A marvel of concrete and iron, a body of stone animated by the lifeblood of Rome. Yet beneath the applause, whispers stirred. Some Romans wondered at the cost how many slaves had laboured to build it, how many animals perished each day, how much blood the empire could spill before the gods grew tired of the noise. Others marvelled at its permanence, certain that this building would outlast them all that Rome had truly built forever. As the 100th day ended, Titus had secured his legacy. The people adored him, the Senate begrudged him, and the Colosseum had entered history not as a monument of marble, but as an engine of awe. Rome had never seen anything like it and would never again. For those who lived through it, The 100 Days were unforgettable a season when the empire's heart beat to the rhythm of drums, screams, and applause. And yet history would remind them, no empire, however glorious, no building, however eternal, escapes the slow hand of time. The blood that stained the sand would dry, the cheers would fade, and one day silence would fall. But that silence belongs to another chapter. For now, let us leave the Colosseum as it was then alive, resplendent and drunk on 100 days of spectacle. If the 100 days of Titus revealed the Colosseum's splendor, the years that followed revealed its true nature. It was not merely a building, nor merely a stage. It was a machine, a carefully engineered engine designed to transform human lives, animal lives, and even the very idea of mortality into a spectacle that Rome consumed like bread and wine. To step inside the Colosseum was to enter a world of choreography. The audience saw only the surface sand fighters, the quick rise of a wild beast. But beneath the arena, hidden from public view, lay a labyrinth of corridors and chambers known as the Hypogeum. It was here that the machine whirred. Slaves strained at great wooden wheels to power elevators. Trapdoors were set like snares ready to spring open. Pulleys creaked, ropes tightened, and platforms rose, carrying men and animals from darkness into sudden blinding light. Imagine the moment one heart-beater gladiator crouched in the gloom the next. He was standing under the sun, cheered or jeered by 50,000 voices. Or a lion caged and furious, suddenly bursting forth from a hole in the earth, leaping onto sand that moments before looked empty. This machinery was as much a marvel as the spectacles themselves. It made death theatrical. It gave cruelty the timing of art. The gladiators were its main performers. They were not a single kind of man, but a mosaic of fates. Many were slaves, captured in war, condemned criminals, forced into the ludus, the gladiator schools that dotted the empire. But some were volunteers men who sought the strange path of glory that the arena offered. To stand in the Colosseum was to gamble death against the slim chance of freedom, disgrace against eternal fame. Each gladiator fought in a style carefully codified to create drama. The Mamillo armoured, heavily shielded broadsword steady. The Retiarius, almost naked, quick as lightning, wielding only a trident and a net. The Secutor, smooth-helmeted, chasing his foe like a hound. The Thraex, with curved blade and small square shield, darting and striking like a bird of prey. Rome loved these contrasts. They turned combat into theatre, forcing the audience to choose favourites to cheer for strength or cunning for defence or agility. But make no mistake, this was slaughter disguised as sport. The sand of the arena drank deeply. At times, it was soaked so heavily with blood that workers had to heap new sand over the crimson floor to keep the spectacle palatable. Men died here by the hundreds and later by the thousands, their bodies dragged away through hidden doors, their names forgotten, except when a poet or historian bothered to record them. And yet the gladiator was also admired. The Romans saw in him a paradox, a slave who embodied freedom, a condemned man who displayed courage, an expendable life that could inspire. Philosophers even spoke of gladiators with reverence as men who accepted death with dignity, who faced fate with stoic calm. To the audience, their agony was entertainment, but also lesson a reminder of how a Roman ought to meet mortality. Beyond the men, the machine fed on beasts. Lions from Africa, bears from the Alps, crocodiles from Egypt, leopards, boars, even ostriches. The Colosseum was a Noah's Ark of cruelty. Each animal brought at great cost, paraded, and then butchered for spectacle. Sometimes they fought men, sometimes they fought each other. Always their deaths were framed as proof of Rome's reach, Rome's control, Rome's ability to dominate not only peoples but nature itself. The logistics were staggering. Animals had to be captured, transported across seas and deserts, kept alive in cages, fed, and then delivered to the Hypogeum beneath the Colosseum. Hundreds died before even reaching Rome, their corpses discarded, their journeys wasted. But those who survived became instruments of awe. A lion leaping on a criminal was not just death, it was empire performing itself. And so the Colosseum became an industry. Bakers supplied bread for the masses. Vendors sold olives, wine, and sausages. Trainers drilled gladiators in barracks. Engineers tested the lifts and pulleys. Slaves cleaned, repaired, hauled and fetched. For every gladiator who stepped onto the sand, there were dozens who worked unseen cogs in the machinery of entertainment. For the audience, though, none of this mattered. They saw only the end product, the thrill, the fear, the applause. A senator in the front row might sip his wine as a man's throat opened before him. A peasant in the cheap seats might cheer with equal fervour, his stomach full for the first time in weeks, thanks to free grain. The Colosseum erased class at least for a few hours. It made everyone equal before the spectacle. Yet it also reinforced hierarchy. The emperor's box gleaming with marble reminded all that he alone held the power of life and death. A thumbs up a reprieve, a thumbs down a final strike. Even the crowd's voice loud, though it was bent ultimately to the emperor's will. In that sense, the Colosseum was propaganda carved in stone, a reminder that Rome gave life and Rome took it away. Some saw the machine for what it was. Philosophers whispered of decadence, poets hinted at cruelty. Early Christians condemned it outright, refusing to enter the arena, calling it a house of demons. But their voices were drowned by cheers, their warnings ignored as lions roared and swords clashed. Rome did not want to reflect on its appetite. It wanted to feed it. Day after day, year after year, the machine turned. New gladiators replaced the fallen. New beasts arrived in chains. New crowds surged through the arches. The Colosseum was not simply a building of stone. It was a living creature, its veins filled with sand and blood, its breath the roar of 50,000 Romans, its appetite endless. And the irony, for all its cruelty, for all its spectacle, the Colosseum endured. Earthquakes, looters, centuries of neglect, none of these would break it entirely. But the men and beasts it devoured, the voices it silenced, the lives it consumed, they were gone in an instant. The Colosseum was eternal. Humanity inside its walls was not. In the end, the Colosseum's genius was also its horror. It took the chaos of death and gave it rhythm. It made cruelty orderly, efficient, and spectacular. It turned blood into entertainment and corpses into applause. It was not just Rome's greatest amphitheater. It was Rome itself, laid bare, mighty, ruthless, and endlessly hungry. By the time the Colosseum settled into its rhythm, Rome had perfected the art of transforming violence into theatre. It was not enough to pit man against man or beast against hunter. No Rome demanded stories. The arena became not only a stage for slaughter, but a canvas on which the empire painted its victories. Every performance was propaganda, every death a reminder that Rome's power stretched farther than the horizon. The Romans loved variety, and variety meant invention. One day, the crowd might see a lone gladiator stand against a charging bull, the next, a grand battle recreated with hundreds of prisoners cast as Rome's defeated enemies. These were no simple plays. They were reenactments of history scripted with real weapons and real blood. To the audience, it was entertainment. To the empire, it was memory retold with a sword. Prisoners of war bore the heaviest burden. When Rome conquered a people, Dacians, Gauls, Parthians, the survivors were sometimes paraded in triumphal processions. But their humiliation did not end in chains. Many were sent to the Colosseum to die, dressed in the costumes of their defeated nations. There they fought not to win, but to lose again, their deaths serving as encore to Rome's victories. Imagine the irony: a soldier who had once fought with courage for his homeland, now reduced to an actor in a pageant where the ending was already written. The crowd loved it. To them, the sight of barbarians falling beneath Roman swords reaffirmed their place at the top of the world. The arena was Rome's mirror, reflecting back the empire's story of conquest. Every corpse was an exclamation mark. At the end of a sentence, Rome conquers, Rome triumphs, Rome endures. Animals too were woven into these dramas. It was not enough to see a lion hunt. Instead, lions might be unleashed on prisoners dressed as mythological villains. Bears could play the role of giants. Even ostriches might be set loose as comic relief. In this way, the Colosseum blurred the lines between myth and reality, between history and legend. Gods and monsters were resurrected in the sand, their roles filled by the condemned. The most astonishing spectacles, however, were the naumachii, the staged naval battles. Though historians still debate the frequency and scale of these events, the accounts are vivid. The arena floor could be flooded by opening channels that led to Rome's aqueducts. Shallow water filled the space where gladiators usually fought, and suddenly the Colosseum became a sea. Wooden ships scaled down but still formidable were hauled in. Crews of condemned men clambered aboard handed oars and weapons and told to fight until death. The effect was surreal. Beneath the gaze of 50,000 war was reduced to entertainment. Oars slapped, water splashed, the crack of wood echoed as ships rammed each other. Arrows darkened the sky. Prisoners screamed as they sank, swallowed by an artificial lake in the heart of Rome. The audience, sheltered under canvas awnings, sipped wine and applauded, delighted by the illusion that history itself had been resurrected. Why such extravagance? Because Rome needed to remind its citizens that it was not simply powerful, it was eternal. By restaging victories, the empire reinforced its myths. A Roman child might not remember the Punic Wars, but he could watch Carthaginian prisoners drown in the arena and learn that Rome had once crushed its enemies on sea as well as land. History was rewritten with blood, ensuring that Rome's triumphs remained vivid, undeniable, and unforgettable. These spectacles were expensive beyond measure. Consider the logistics: the wood for ships, the chains for prisoners, the capture and transport of exotic animals, the wages of trainers, handlers, and engineers. Entire provinces were plundered not only for tribute, but for entertainment. Yet no expense was spared because the Colosseum was not a place for thrift. It was the emperor's stage, and every performance was an investment in loyalty. Bread filled bellies, but blood filled imaginations. Together, they silenced dissent. Even the smallest details were crafted for effect. Painted backdrops lined the arena. Costumes gave condemned men the likeness of mythic figures. At times, painted scenery would transform the sand into forests or deserts. The audience stepped into worlds beyond Rome without leaving their seats. For the poor who might never travel beyond the city's walls, the Colosseum was a window onto empire. And there was laughter too, dark though it was. Comic spectacles were interspersed with tragedy. Dwarfs fought mock battles. Animals were trained for absurd tricks. The line between cruelty and humour blurred until the crowd barely distinguished one from the other. For the Romans, laughter and blood were siblings born of the same appetite. The Colosseum thus became more than entertainment. It was Rome's theatre of empire, where history was rewritten, where myth was revived, and where the emperor presided not as host, but as god. When Titus or his successors sat in their gilded seats, they were not merely rulers. They were playwrights of death, choreographers of memory. And yet, as the years passed, unease began to creep into the margins. Philosophers asked whether such spectacles dulled the soul. Early Christians whispered that the Colosseum was a house of demons. Even some senators grumbled at the cost, but their voices were drowned by cheers. For most Romans, the arena was irresistible. Its stories, however brutal, were sweeter than silence. If you stood in the Colosseum in those years, you would see more than sand and blood. You would see an empire telling itself who it was. You would see prisoners forced to die as enemies of myth animals, sacrificed as symbols of dominion ships colliding on a false sea. You would see Rome not only celebrating its past, but rehearsing its future, a performance of power meant to last as long as the stones themselves. And for a while it worked. The Colosseum stood as the empire's loudest voice, declaring to citizen and stranger alike, "This is Rome. This is eternity. This is glory." But eternity, as the Romans would learn, has a way of running out. The applause would fade. The machinery would slow. And the Colosseum, once a theatre of empire, would become something else entirely. The Colosseum was born of stone, but it lived on in memory. Long after the cheers had faded and the sand had dried its walls, seemed to whisper. They whispered of blood, spilled of lives, ended of a city that had once feasted on death as though it were bread. In those whispers, Romans began to hear something more: ghosts. For centuries, the arena had been a place where tens of thousands died, some with honour, many in agony. Their cries, their breath, their last words sank into the stone. To those who came after the Colosseum, seemed haunted not only by spirits, but by guilt. Even as Rome prided itself on its grandeur, unease grew around the shadows that lingered within the arches. Stories of hauntings became common. Night watchmen swore they heard the clash of swords in empty corridors. Travellers told of phantom roars as if lions still prowled beneath the sand. Flickers of movement in the moonlight were said to be the shades of gladiators forever fighting battles they could not win. In a city that mingled pagan gods, ancestral spirits, and emerging Christian saints, it was easy to believe the Colosseum had become a crossroads of restless souls. The association with martyrdom deepened this sense of unease. Though historians still debate whether Christians were systematically executed in the Colosseum medieval tradition, insisted they had been. Sermons spoke of men and women torn apart by beasts, their prayers rising even as the crowd mocked. Pilgrims came to kneel among the broken stones, convinced they were standing on holy ground, watered with holy blood. The Colosseum, once a stage of empire, was reimagined as an altar of sacrifice. To early Christians, this transformation was symbolic. The empire that had once wielded the Colosseum as a weapon of fear would one day collapse, but the faith of the martyrs would endure. They told and retold the tale of martyrs, serenely accepting death, their calm defiance, a sharper rebuke than any sword. Whether fact or embellishment mattered little. The idea was powerful, and the Colosseum became more than ruin. It became memory made stone. Superstition mingled with sanctity. Medieval Romans avoided the Colosseum at night, fearful of spirits and demons said to inhabit its arches. Some claimed witches gathered there performing rites amid the broken stairways. Others spoke of alchemists searching for treasures buried beneath the arena floor. The ruin became a threshold space, neither fully cursed nor fully holy, both feared and revered. And yet, ordinary life persisted. Farmers grazed animals in its shadow. Merchants set up stalls near its arches. Children played among the weeds that sprouted where emperors once sat. To them, the ghosts were distant, half-believed tales told by elders. But to travellers and pilgrims, the Colosseum loomed with otherworldly weight. They came not to cheer spectacles, but to stand in awe of what had been, to feel the silence heavy on their shoulders. The whispers of blood also carried into art and imagination. Medieval poets wrote of the Colosseum as a mouth of hell, its arches gaping like teeth, its corridors like intestines of some devouring beast. To stand before it was to confront death not as an event, but as a presence. Even broken, even half collapsed, the amphitheater seemed alive with all that had happened there. The irony was sharp. Rome had built the Colosseum to prove its eternity, to make its glory unassailable. And yet, within centuries, it became instead a monument to fragility. The empire that had filled it with blood was gone. The voices that once roared approval were silenced. What remained was the echo. An arena where ghosts outnumbered spectators, where silence shouted louder than applause. But those echoes also ensured survival. Because the Colosseum was remembered not only as ruin, but as sacred space, it avoided total destruction. Stones were stolen, arches cannibalized, but some restraint lingered. To destroy it entirely would be to desecrate something more than history. Even in its brokenness, it demanded reverence. If you had walked into the Colosseum during the early Middle Ages, you would not have seen the thunder of games or the fury of lions. Instead, you would have found silence grass pushing through cracks, perhaps a shepherd leading goats across the same sand once drenched in blood. And yet, if you lingered, if the wind caught the arches just right, you might have thought you heard something, a cheer, a roar, the cry of a man falling. Perhaps it was only the mind playing tricks. Or perhaps the Colosseum still carried its memories, unable to forget. This duality, ruin and shrine horror and holiness, gave the Colosseum a new life. It was no longer simply a machine of slaughter. It was now a vessel of memory, where Rome's past bled into its present. A place where citizens walked not to cheer, but to wonder, and perhaps to shudder. And so the Colosseum endured no longer a stage for empire, but a monument to all that empire had cost. Its arches framed not only the sky, but the weight of history, whispering to every passerby, glory fades, power falls. But blood leaves echoes that never truly die. For more than 3 centuries, the Colosseum thundered with applause shouts and the cries of the dying. Generations of Romans were born, lived and died, knowing that the amphitheater was the city's heart. But hearts grow weary, and even the strongest pulse eventually falters. The Colosseum's decline was not sudden. It was a slow dimming like a fire that flickers lower with each passing year until at last only smoke remains. By the early 4th century, Rome itself was changing. Christianity, once a persecuted faith, whispered in catacombs, now spread openly across the empire. In 313 CE, Emperor Constantine legalized the religion. A few decades later, it had grown from tolerated faith to dominant force. With its rise came a new moral lens through which the games were judged. The Christians despised them. To their eyes, the Colosseum was not a theatre, but a charnel house. How could a faith built on mercy, forgiveness, and the sanctity of life tolerate a place where human beings were butchered for amusement? Sermons thundered against the arena, calling it a house of demons. Stories of martyrs supposedly torn apart by lions inside its walls gave it the aura of a cursed shrine. To step into the Colosseum was in Christian teaching to flirt with sin. The shift was slow but unmistakable. The Roman elite, now often Christian themselves, grew uncomfortable with sponsoring lavish spectacles. The emperors too began to favour less bloody displays. Chariot races held in the Circus Maximus grew more popular, their thrills safer for the conscience. Public taste was changing. Blood no longer thrilled as it once had. Economics hastened the decline. The empire was no longer the young, vigorous conqueror of the world. By the 4th century, its frontiers strained against barbarian incursions. The treasury groaned under the weight of defending too much land with too little wealth. To stage a spectacle in the Colosseum was ruinously expensive. Animals had to be imported from Africa, prisoners transported from wars, gladiators trained and housed. What once had been a proud symbol of abundance became a financial burden. And so the frequency of games dwindled. Where once the arena had seen festivals lasting weeks, now there might be only a few days each year. Gladiator schools began to close. Exotic animals grew harder to obtain. The Colosseum, once overflowing with spectacle, stood silent for longer stretches between events. There is a story, perhaps legend, perhaps truth, of the last gladiatorial combat in Rome. It was 404 CE. The Emperor Honorius had declared an end to the games influenced by Christian advisors. But tradition died hard. When one final spectacle was staged, a monk named Telemachus stepped into the arena. Horrified by the bloodshed, he cried out for it to stop. The crowd, enraged, stoned him to death. Yet his sacrifice struck a chord. Soon after, gladiatorial combat was outlawed altogether. The Colosseum's sand, which had drunk blood for centuries, would drink no more. The beast hunts lingered a little longer. Even as gladiators vanished the Venetians, the staged hunts continued into the 6th century. But without the grandeur of earlier centuries, they became shadows of their former selves. Rome itself was weakening its power, fraying at the edges. What empire could afford to import elephants and lions when barbarians pressed at its borders? By the time the Western Empire fell in 476 CE, the Colosseum was already fading into memory. Its arches still loomed, but the life within them had drained away. Grass sprouted in the cracks where senators once sat. The underground tunnels echoed with emptiness rather than the growls of caged beasts. Where once the roar of 50,000 shook the stones, now silence reigned. And yet silence had its own weight. The Colosseum endured not as a forgotten ruin, but as a relic that carried too much history to ignore. Pilgrims visited it half in awe, half in dread. They saw not a stadium, but a monument to a dead world. To them, the Colosseum symbolized Rome's fall as much as its glory. The irony was sharp. Rome had built the Colosseum to declare its eternity, but eternity belonged not to the empire nor to its games, but to the stone itself. The spectacles were gone. The emperors who had commissioned them were dust. Yet the amphitheater remained scarred but unbroken, its arches like open eyes staring at the centuries to come. If you stood in the Colosseum in those early medieval years, you would find no emperor, no gladiator, no lion. You would find silence broken only by the wind threading through the arches. Perhaps a shepherd led goats across the arena floor. Perhaps children clambered over the marble steps, their laughter echoing faintly. But always beneath those sounds lingered the memory of what had once been. The fall of the games did not mean the death of the Colosseum. On the contrary, it was the beginning of its second life as ruin, as quarry, as fortress, as shrine. But that is another chapter. For now, let us leave the arena in its first silence, its sand unstained for the first time in centuries. A silence heavy, not empty. A silence that remembered. For centuries, the Colosseum had been a machine of spectacle, then a shrine of memory. But empires fade, faiths shift, and time itself works quietly, gnawing at the strongest stone. The Colosseum, though vast and proud, was no immortal god. It was a body of mortar and travertine subject to the same frailty as the men who once fought inside it. And when nature decided to strike even Rome's greatest amphitheater, trembled. The first blow came not from sword or fire, but from the earth itself. Rome sat on restless ground, and earthquakes had always haunted the city. In the year 847 CE, the earth shuddered with terrible force. Buildings collapsed, churches cracked, statues toppled. And the Colosseum, that mountain of arches and stones, suffered wounds it could not conceal. The south side, which had stood since the age of Vespasian, crumbled. Massive blocks of travertine broke loose, tumbling like dice across the Roman streets. Entire sections of the upper wall collapsed, leaving the amphitheater lopsided, its once perfect oval broken. The air filled with dust, and when it cleared, Romans gazed upon a monument no longer whole. The Colosseum was still immense, still awe-inspiring, but now scarred like a warrior bearing the mark of battle. Those who lived through it spoke with awe. Some said it was punishment from God, a judgment against Rome for its past sins of bloodshed. Others saw it as a sign of the empire's final death, centuries after its political collapse. For the common people, it was simpler still. The amphitheater was no longer eternal. It could fall just like the world around them. And yet the ruin did not end there. Another earthquake struck in 1231 CE, further shattering the already wounded structure. More stones tumbled, more arches cracked, until the Colosseum seemed less a building than a vast skeleton, ribs of stone curving against the sky. The southern wall remained jagged, exposing the interior to the open air. What had once been a perfect ellipse of power became a broken circle of memory. Travellers wrote of the site with wonder and melancholy. Pilgrims who came to Rome described the Colosseum as both ruin and miracle. Its sheer scale still humbled them. Even broken, it was larger than any other monument they had ever seen. And yet its wounds spoke louder than its endurance. The fallen stones reminded them that no empire, no matter how mighty, escapes the hand of time. Medieval chroniclers painted it in vivid imagery. One wrote that the Colosseum looked like the shell of a giant beast slain by God, its bones left to bleach in the sun. Another described it as the mouth of hell itself, yawning wide with jagged teeth. To stand before it was to feel both fear and awe, a reminder that Rome had once been great, but was now fallen. The earthquakes also gave the Colosseum a new role as quarry. The broken stones, scattered and abundant, were irresistible to builders. Noble families and even popes carted away blocks to construct palaces, churches and fountains. The very marble that had once gleamed in the amphitheater now gleamed in basilicas across the city. The Colosseum's wounds became Rome's new skin. But the ruin itself, though diminished, endured. Even as half its body was stolen, half remained. The arches still rose in tiers. The corridors still wound in circles. The arena, though overgrown, still yawned at its heart. And above all, its silhouette still dominated the skyline. Broken though it was, the Colosseum continued to watch Rome, a scarred giant refusing to vanish. If you had walked the streets of medieval Rome, you would have seen this strange vision: one side of the Colosseum, tall and proud, the other collapsed and jagged. Children climbed among the rubble. Goats grazed on tufts of grass, sprouting in the cracks. Merchants sold wares in the shadow of arches that no longer supported anything. And through it all, the ruin loomed, both part of daily life and something far greater. The earthquakes had changed the Colosseum forever. They had stripped away its perfection, but in doing so, they had given it a new identity. No longer the flawless oval of imperial pride, it was now a testament to endurance through ruin. Its broken form carried a new kind of beauty, the beauty of survival. Later ages would romanticize this. Painters would depict the Colosseum not as it had been in its glory, but as it stood in ruin, its arches glowing in twilight ivy, climbing its walls, moonlight spilling across its jagged edges. Poets would write of it as the emblem of time's power, the proof that all empires fall. The earthquakes, destructive though they were, gave the Colosseum a second life as symbol, not of Rome's dominance, but of history's inevitability. And so the amphitheater endured. Scarred, scavenged, half-collapsed but enduring. Its southern wall gone, its symmetry ruined, yet still standing. Rome itself had fallen, risen and fallen again. But the Colosseum, broken though it was, remained to remind every passerby, nothing is eternal, not even stone. The Colosseum had endured centuries of blood, faith and earthquakes, but it was not time alone that broke it. It was human hands, eager, practical and utterly unromantic. By the Middle Ages, Romans no longer saw the amphitheater as an untouchable monument. They saw it as the city's most convenient pile of construction materials. And so the Colosseum became not just a ruin, but a quarry. It began with necessity. The earthquakes of the 9th and 13th centuries had torn loose countless blocks of travertine. These lay scattered at the base of the amphitheater, already cut, polished and shaped by ancient engineers. Why quarry new stone from distant hills when you could simply take what lay at your feet? To the builders of medieval Rome, the Colosseum was less a wonder of antiquity and more a divine delivery service. Cart by cart, oxen dragged away its bones. Massive blocks were hauled into town squares, churches, palaces and fountains. Each piece carried with it not only weight, but memory. A stone that once echoed with the roar of lions might now form the wall of a chapel. A fragment of marble that once bore the scuff marks of senators' sandals might now shine as an altar. Rome was consuming its own past, digesting the Colosseum into its body one stone at a time. The noble families were the first to feast. The Frangipani, the Annibaldi, the Orsini. These names filled medieval chronicles and their palaces still mark Rome today. Many of those palaces, strong and imposing, are built with Colosseum stone. For them, it was a declaration of dominance to live inside walls, once raised by emperors, was to cloak themselves in borrowed imperial power. When guests dined in their halls, they did so surrounded by fragments of gladiatorial death. The church too eagerly joined the harvest. Popes who preached of mercy on Sundays saw no contradiction in stripping pagan monuments on Mondays. To them, the Colosseum was a ready quarry, and to reuse its stone was almost symbolic, a way of turning the arena of Christian martyrdom into the material of Christian triumph. Basilica walls, cloisters and bell towers across the city still whisper with that irony. Most famously, parts of St. Peter's Basilica rose from Colosseum stone. The world's most sacred church, a beacon of Christendom, was literally mortared together with blocks from the amphitheater that had once echoed with executions. To pilgrims, this may have seemed poetic justice. To historians, it is a reminder of how seamlessly destruction and creation intertwine. But not all the stolen stone went into holy architecture. Some found humbler uses. Workshops paved their floors with Colosseum slabs. Bakers built ovens from its bricks. Stonemasons hacked apart the marble into thresholds and steps. In medieval Rome, the amphitheater was as likely to become someone's staircase as someone's cathedral. The theft was not subtle. If you wander through the Colosseum today, you can still see the scars, rows of holes where iron clamps were gouged out, jagged gaps where blocks were pried loose. Each wound marks another day when a mason's chisel chipped away at history. Some historians estimate that nearly half the Colosseum's missing stone vanished not in earthquakes, but in wagons stolen to build the new Rome rising around it. This process was not seen as sacrilege. Medieval Romans had no concept of preservation as we know it. Ancient ruins were not historical treasures. They were resources. To let perfectly usable stone sit in a ruin while one struggled to quarry new material would have seemed foolish. And so the Colosseum was recycled, its grandeur reduced to practical usefulness. For ordinary Romans, the amphitheater's decline carried no sadness. To them, it was simply a part of life. When a wall collapsed, you harvested it. When you needed a cornerstone, you took it. To live in Rome during those centuries was to walk on fragments of the Colosseum daily. Its bones paved roads, its blocks filled homes, its marble shimmered in fountains. The amphitheater was everywhere, scattered like relics across the eternal city. Visitors from abroad, however, were horrified. Pilgrims and scholars arriving from distant lands expected to see the great arena of the Caesars intact and overwhelming. Instead, they found a broken husk. Its grandeur pillaged its stones, missing its southern flank stripped bare. Accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries often describe their disappointment mingled with awe at what still remained. They saw a contradiction, an arena that was both monumental and mutilated. But Rome itself did not apologise. For Romans, the Colosseum's cannibalisation was progress. The city could not live in the shadow of its past forever. Its stones had to be repurposed to serve the present. Each church palace and fountain built from the amphitheater's carcass was not seen as an act of destruction, but as a continuation of Rome's legacy. What mattered was not preserving the past, but ensuring that Rome remained alive. And so through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the Colosseum's stones migrated across the city. To trace them is to trace Rome's transformation. They lie in the Basilica of San Giovanni, in Laterano, in the steps of Palazzi, in the fountains that gurgle in sunlit piazzas. Even today, to admire much of Rome is unknowingly to admire fragments of the Colosseum. The amphitheater itself, meanwhile, slouched deeper into ruin. By the 15th century, half its body was gone. What remained was still immense but visibly incomplete. Travellers compared it to a broken crown, once dazzling, now shattered. Locals shrugged, accustomed to its absence. To them, the Colosseum was not a ruin to be mourned, but a warehouse to be emptied. And yet, despite the centuries of plunder, the Colosseum never disappeared. Its bones were scattered, yes, but its skeleton still stood. Half an arena was still more imposing than most entire structures, and its presence, even broken, carried power. The Colosseum, reduced to quarry, still managed to outlast its thieves. Thus, the amphitheater lived two lives at once. One as a ruin crumbling in the heart of Rome, the other as fragments built into churches, fountains, palaces, and houses. The missing half of the Colosseum did not vanish. It simply dispersed, becoming Rome itself. By the 12th century, the Colosseum's body had already been broken by earthquakes and carted away by masons. Yet even in ruin, it remained too vast, too commanding to ignore. Its arches still loomed over Rome like a crown half shattered. And so rather than treat it as a relic or a ruin, the city's nobility decided to do something audacious. They moved in. The Colosseum became a castle. The first to seize it were the Frangipani family, one of Rome's most powerful dynasties. They were the sort of nobles who thrived on ambition and warfare. And when they looked at the Colosseum, they didn't see a ruin. They saw a fortress ready-made by the emperors. Its stone arches were thick walls. Its many entrances could become defensible gates. Its circular corridors could channel defenders like a labyrinth. It was quite simply the largest stronghold in Rome. The Frangipani fortified it. They bricked up arches, raised towers, and walled off sections of the outer ring. What had once been entrances for roaring crowds now became barred gateways shut tight against rival families. Where emperors once strolled in marble corridors, soldiers now sharpened swords and stored grain. The Colosseum, once a theatre of blood sport, became a theatre of survival. To guests invited inside, the sight must have been surreal. Imagine walking through the same arches where gladiators once entered the arena, only now the air smelled of cooking fires and the stench of livestock. Silk-robed nobles feasted in chambers where lions had once been caged. Children played in courtyards where thousands had once cheered. What had been an amphitheater of death had transformed into a medieval palace of ambition. The Frangipani weren't alone for long. The Annibaldi clan, another powerful Roman family, claimed part of the Colosseum for themselves. Medieval Rome was a city constantly at war with itself, where noble families turned streets into battlegrounds and towers into battlements. The Colosseum, vast enough to hold them both, became contested ground, its arches echoing not with cheers, but with the shouts of rival guards. Chroniclers of the time described the absurdity with both awe and disdain. One monk noted bitterly that Rome's most famous monument had been reduced to a fortress of pride, its stones echoing not with the glory of emperors, but with the quarrels of squabbling lords. Yet for the nobles themselves, the Colosseum was the ultimate prize. To claim it was to cloak themselves in the faded aura of empire. For ordinary Romans, it was a spectacle of a different sort. They watched as the Frangipani and Annibaldi draped banners from its arches, reinforcing crumbling walls with new masonry, installing gates where once crowds had flowed freely. The amphitheater had become a private estate, a castle in the heart of the city. What emperors once held for all of Rome was now held by a handful of ambitious families. The fortress life inside was not glamorous. Rain leaked through broken arches, rubble-filled corridors. Sections of the building were already collapsed, and goats often wandered in despite the noble attempts to wall them out. Yet, for all its discomforts, the Colosseum projected raw power. No other family could boast of holding Rome's greatest ruin as their stronghold. There is a dark humour in imagining a banquet inside the Colosseum during this time. Nobles in velvet robes, goblets of wine in hand, toasting their dominance while dining in chambers haunted by centuries of blood. Their laughter would have mingled with the memory of screams. Their feasts unfolded in a place where bread and circuses had once kept an empire enthralled. The Colosseum, ever adaptable, simply shifted its role from amphitheater to fortress, from public stage to private prize. It wasn't only human ambition that reshaped the Colosseum in this age. The building itself became a weapon. Arrows could be fired from its high arches, its massive walls deflected catapult stones. Enemies who dared assault it found themselves dwarfed by its bulk. Even in ruin, the amphitheater was a formidable fortress, one that terrified rivals and awed visitors. But with power came envy, and the families who claimed the Colosseum did not hold it unchallenged. For centuries, noble clans squabbled over pieces of the ruin, just as they squabbled over every tower and palace in medieval Rome. The Colosseum became a contested estate, a fortress whose stones echoed with petty feuds instead of imperial glory. The absurdity was not lost on foreign travellers. Pilgrims arriving from across Christendom often remarked that the greatest amphitheater of antiquity was no longer a monument, but a fortified townhouse. Some found it shameful. Others found it hilarious. A ruin that had once staged the might of emperors was now the backdrop for the soap opera of Roman nobility. And yet, in its own strange way, this period kept the Colosseum alive. By inhabiting it, the Frangipani and Annibaldi ensured that the amphitheater did not vanish entirely into rubble. Their fortifications, crude though they were, prevented further collapse. Their very presence gave the ruin a new function, however strange. For a time, the Colosseum was not a relic of the past, but a fortress of the present. By the 14th century, however, noble power shifted, and the Colosseum's role as fortress waned. Families abandoned it for more comfortable palaces. Rainweeds and goats returned. The amphitheater sagged back into ruin, relieved of its absurd role as castle. Yet the memory lingered. For centuries afterward, Romans would recall how their greatest monument had once been claimed by feuding families who turned history's largest arena into the world's most bizarre palace. Thus, the Colosseum lived yet another life, neither as arena nor ruin alone, but as fortress. Its stones had witnessed emperors, gladiators, martyrs, pilgrims, and now nobles in velvet wielding power from within its crumbling walls. It had been built for spectacle, and in a sense, it never stopped performing. The Colosseum had already been torn by earthquakes and fortified by noble families. But in the Middle Ages, another power rose over Rome, a power greater than any family, stronger than any fortress, the popes. And when the papacy looked at the Colosseum, it did not see a ruin nor even a fortress. It saw a treasure chest of sacred building material ready to be claimed for the glory of God. For centuries, churchmen had spoken of the amphitheater as a site of martyrdom. Legends spread that countless Christians had been slaughtered within its walls, torn apart by lions, or executed before jeering crowds. Whether entirely accurate or not, the story stuck. To Christians, the Colosseum was no longer just an old stadium. It was a shrine of sacrifice, a monument soaked with holy blood. And yet, paradoxically, it was also too tempting to leave untouched. Those same walls that once echoed with pagan cruelty now gleamed with marble iron and stone, all of which the growing church desperately needed. Cathedrals, monasteries, palaces of bishops all required materials. Why quarry new stone from distant hills when God himself, so it seemed, had left a mountain of ready-cut blocks in the heart of Rome? The popes authorized the stripping. Marble was pried from the walls hauled away to decorate churches. Travertine blocks were carted off to build basilicas. Even the iron clamps that held the Colosseum's bones together were gouged out, melted down, and reforged into nails, weapons, and bells. Each removal weakened the amphitheater further, leaving behind scars still visible today. Pockmarks where once gleaming metal held stone to stone. The irony was breathtaking. A building once condemned as the stage of Christian suffering was being dismembered to glorify the Christian faith. Marble that had framed executions now framed altars. Iron that had supported the cries of gladiators now rang out as church bells. Pagan Rome's slaughterhouse was slowly dismantled and reborn as the skeleton of Holy Rome. Some popes even spoke of this openly. They justified the recycling as transformation, a way of redeeming the Colosseum's pagan past by weaving it into the fabric of Christendom. If the amphitheater had once mocked mercy, now its stones would embody it. If its arches once resounded with cruelty, now they would resound with prayer. To them, it was not desecration, but sanctification. Yet not all agreed. Some chroniclers lamented the destruction, arguing that the Colosseum was a wonder that should have been preserved. Pilgrims from abroad often expressed shock when they arrived, expecting to see the amphitheater intact, only to find it half dismantled, its marble carted away by the church itself. To them, Rome seemed like a city cannibalizing its greatest treasure. But the work continued. By the Renaissance, much of St. Peter's Basilica, the most magnificent church in Christendom, stood upon Colosseum stone. Many of Rome's great palaces gleamed with marble, stripped from the amphitheater. To walk through the Eternal City was to walk through fragments of the Colosseum, scattered and reborn as Christian architecture. Even fountains carried its legacy. The elegant sprays and carved basins that decorated piazzas drew water over stone, first cut for gladiators. The very arteries of Rome, its aqueduct-fed fountains, owed something to the bones of the Colosseum. And yet, the ruin itself endured stubbornly, refusing to vanish. Even as its body was pillaged, its silhouette still dominated the skyline. Travellers marvelled that despite centuries of theft, it remained massive, unignorable. Half gone but half still present, it stood as both monument and warning, a reminder of Rome's greatness and of its willingness to consume its own past. What makes this chapter of the Colosseum's story so haunting is not merely the theft, but the contradiction. The church that condemned the bloodshed also sanctified the ruin. Pilgrims prayed at its arches, even as stonemasons dismantled them. The amphitheater was both relic and quarry, holy ground and hardware store. In this paradox lies the strange genius of Rome. No stone was wasted, no past was left untouched. Even destruction became creation. The Colosseum lost half its body, but in doing so it seeded the rebirth of the city around it. Today, if you admire the gleaming dome of St. Peter's, the solemn arches of San Giovanni in Laterano, or the fountains that sparkle in piazzas, you are in some sense admiring the Colosseum. Not the ruin that still stands, but the half that was taken, sanctified, and transformed. The amphitheater may have lost its marble, but it gained immortality by dispersing itself across the Eternal City. The popes saw it as divine recycling. Historians see it as plunder. But perhaps the truth is both. The Colosseum's sacred stones remind us that history is never simply preserved. It is always being rewritten, reused, reimagined. And in Rome, the past is never past. It is underfoot in the walls around you, ringing in the bells above you. By the Middle Ages, the Colosseum's marble cladding was gone. Its travertine blocks carted away, its arches scarred by earthquakes. But even then, the ruins still clung together. What kept it upright was not just stone, but the invisible skeleton inside it, thousands of iron clamps driven deep into the blocks bound with molten lead. These clamps were the hidden veins of the Colosseum, the quiet strength that allowed it to endure centuries of blood and tremors. And then the thieves came for them. Iron was precious in medieval Rome. It was the lifeblood of blacksmiths, the substance of nails, horseshoes, swords, ploughs, hinges, and tools. Fresh iron was expensive and hard to smelt. But in the centre of Rome stood the world's largest stockpile of ready-made metal locked into the bones of a ruin. To the practical mind, it was irresistible. So they hacked. With chisels, hammers, and brute strength, workers dug into the travertine, prying out the clamps that held centuries of stone in place. Each theft was an act of surgery without care for the patient. Once the iron was removed, the blocks shifted walls, sagged arches cracked. The ruin began to unravel from within. Not by earthquake this time, but by deliberate dismantling. The scars are still visible today. Walk around the Colosseum's walls, and you will see rows of small square holes dotting the surface like the marks of a giant woodpecker. These are the wounds left by the iron thieves' scars of greed etched forever into the stone. What earthquakes could not finish the chisels of men nearly did. Contemporaries hardly blinked. To them, it was practical. A city needed nails more than it needed a ruin. The amphitheater had been abandoned as entertainment centuries before. Why preserve a pagan monument when its bones could be turned into useful metal? In a sense, the Colosseum became a hardware store, a place where Romans could collect free iron as casually as gathering firewood. Some of the metal reforged into swords carried by mercenaries who fought for rival nobles. Some melted into church bells tolling the hours of prayer across a city built on ruin. Some became hinges for doors, nails for beams, ploughs for farmers' fields. The Colosseum, once the grandest stage of Rome, was being eaten piece by piece to build ordinary life. Travellers of the period remarked upon its condition with shock. Pilgrims from northern Europe accustomed to churches of wood and castles of smaller stone gaped at the sheer scale of the ruin. But they also noticed the scars. They described it as a carcass riddled with wounds gnawed by time and by men alike. To them, it was unthinkable that such grandeur should be treated as scrap. To Romans, it was simply survival. Imagine the sound, the clink of hammer on chisel, the groan of stone as iron was pulled free, the creak of wagons carrying the loot away. It must have seemed endless, a slow bleeding that stretched over centuries. Every clamp removed made the ruin weaker, but no one stopped. Each small theft felt trivial. Only when added together did they dismantle an empire's greatest monument. Symbolically, the theft of iron is haunting. Iron had once been the hidden strength of Rome, the unseen force that bound its stones into permanence. Now that strength was torn away and scattered reforged into tools of a very different age. The Colosseum lost not only its marble and stone, but its very skeleton, the invisible sinews that had held it whole. The irony deepens when we realize what the iron became. Bells forged from Colosseum clamps rang above churches built with Colosseum stone. Weapons hammered from its skeleton spilled blood in feuds fought beneath its shadow. Ploughs made from its metal cut furrows in fields that once fed pilgrims gazing at its arches. The amphitheater's very bones were recycled into the heartbeat of medieval life. And yet, despite the theft, the Colosseum did not collapse entirely. Its architects had built it too well. Even without many of its clamps, enough stone remained interlocked to keep the skeleton standing. It leaned, it cracked, but it endured. The ruin became a paradox, weakened to its core, yet still too massive to die. Later generations would marvel at this. Renaissance scholars saw the holes left by the iron thieves and shook their heads. To them, it was vandalism of the worst kind. They called it proof of medieval ignorance, a sign that Romans no longer respected their own past. But they too used Colosseum stone in their palaces and fountains. The cycle of plunder was never truly broken, only justified differently. Even now, when visitors walk through the Colosseum, the scars remain. Guides point to the little square holes and explain their story. Tourists snap photos, often without realizing the tragedy they represent. Each hollow is a missing piece of the amphitheater's skeleton, stolen long ago, melted, reshaped, and forgotten. If you listen closely, though, those holes still whisper. They tell of a time when Rome was less a museum than a workshop, when ruins were not sacred but useful, when history was not preserved but consumed. They remind us that the Colosseum's survival is not just a miracle of engineering, but a miracle of endurance against centuries of theft. The Colosseum had lost its iron, its hidden veins torn out. It was weaker now, sagging more vulnerable than ever. But still, it stood scarred, yet defiant. A hollowed giant refusing to fall. By the late Middle Ages, the Colosseum was no longer an arena of blood, nor a fortress of nobles, nor simply a quarry. It had become something stranger, quieter, and far more ordinary. The greatest amphitheater of antiquity, once filled with emperors, gladiators, and roaring crowds, turned into a neighborhood. Its arches became walls, its corridors became streets, its broken grandeur became home. The change happened gradually, almost unnoticed. As noble families abandoned the Colosseum, its vast hollow interior stood empty, a shell too large to ignore. The arches of the outer walls, once doorways for 50,000 spectators, offered ready-made alcoves for shops and dwellings. To a poor Roman family, those stone vaults were irresistible, already roofed, already sturdy, already part of the city. So they moved in. By the 14th century, records tell us of workshops set up in the arches. Blacksmiths hammered at anvils where senators once strolled. Cobblers stitched leather sandals in the shade of crumbling tiers. Bakers lit ovens in chambers that had once echoed with the cries of the dying. The Colosseum, which had once fed the people with bread and spectacle, now fed them with bread of another kind, daily, ordinary, unglamorous. Soon after came homes. Families built small dwellings within the arches, walling off spaces with brick or timber, installing doors where entrances once stood open. Chickens scratched in the dust. Laundry hung from ropes strung between ancient columns. Children chased one another up stairways that emperors had climbed. At night, the glow of candlelight flickered inside vaults once filled with applause. To live in the Colosseum was not seen as romantic. It was practical. Housing in Rome was scarce expensive and often unsafe. The amphitheater, massive and immovable, offered stability. Its arches sheltered families from rain and wind. Its thick stone walls promised protection in times of unrest. The Colosseum was no longer a monument to empire, but a bulwark of survival for the poor. Travellers who came to Rome during these centuries were astonished. They had expected to see the grand ruin of antiquity silent and solemn. Instead, they found it alive with noise, the clang of hammers, the chatter of markets, the smell of bread and smoke. Pilgrims arriving from distant lands described the surreal sight of ordinary life nestled into the world's greatest ruin. The Colosseum was no longer the emperor's stage, but the people's neighborhood. Some accounts even speak of gardens planted inside. In the central arena, where once lions and gladiators had clashed, peasants tilled soil and grew vegetables. Goats grazed on patches of grass sprouting between broken seats. The amphitheater had become a pastoral scene, a mixture of ruin and farm. What had once been stained with blood was now watered with rain and sweat, growing food for families who could never have afforded farmland outside the city. By the Renaissance, the Colosseum housed a small but thriving community. Scholars and artists might have admired it as a ruin of antiquity, but to the locals, it was simply home. They lived among its stones as casually as others lived in ordinary houses. To them, the amphitheater's grandeur was less important than its shelter. They did not marvel at the arches or mourn the lost marble. They cooked, slept, worked, and raised children. The church noticed. In the 14th and 15th centuries, popes occasionally tried to regulate life inside the Colosseum. Some worried about the indignity of turning such a monument into a slum. Others worried about crime, for the labyrinth of corridors made an excellent hiding place for thieves. Yet enforcement was difficult. The Colosseum was too vast, too open, too useful to drive people out. And so for centuries, ordinary Romans continued to dwell in its shadow and within its walls. The image is haunting. A structure once intended for 50,000 cheering citizens now echoed with the voices of a few hundred poor families. Where emperors once commanded the crowd, women now scrubbed laundry. Where gladiators once saluted deaf children learned to walk. The amphitheater had become not a stage of empire, but a cradle of survival. There was a strange poetry to it too. Rome had built the Colosseum to serve the masses, feeding them bread and spectacle. Centuries later, it still served the masses not with lions or gladiators, but with shelter and livelihood. Its function had shifted, but its purpose endured to be a vessel for the lives of ordinary Romans. Some Renaissance travellers sneered at this transformation, calling it degradation, a humiliation of history. To them, the Colosseum should have been revered, not inhabited. But in truth, the families who lived there gave it a kind of continuity. They kept it alive not as an empty ruin, but as a lived-in monument. While scholars wrote of its grandeur, they cooked dinners inside it. While artists sketched its arches, they hung laundry from them. It is easy now to romanticize their lives, to imagine the charm of living inside the Colosseum. But for those who did, it was simply necessity. They endured cold winters in damp stone vaults, hot summers beneath blazing arches, and the constant fear that parts of the structure might collapse. And yet, despite these hardships, they stayed. For centuries, the amphitheater was their neighborhood, their world, their Rome. The Colosseum, then, was never only a ruin. It was always alive, reshaped by each generation to suit its needs. From stage to shrine, from quarry to fortress, from monument to marketplace, it endured by changing. Its arches, once filled with the cries of dying gladiators, now rang with the laughter of children and the calls of street vendors. And in that transformation, it revealed its deepest truth, that no monument, no matter how mighty, belongs only to history. It belongs to those who live among its stones. By the 17th century, the Colosseum was no longer a fortress of nobles, nor a bustling neighbourhood of shops. Its arches still sheltered a few workshops and weeds still sprouted from its tiers, but its fate was shifting once again. This time, it was not nobles or peasants who redefined it. It was the church which claimed the amphitheatre not as quarry or slum, but as sacred ground. For centuries, Christians had whispered of martyrdom in the Colosseum. Sermons told of men and women thrown to lions for refusing to renounce Christ. Pilgrims imagined the sand soaked with holy blood. Whether or not the stories were historically exact hardly mattered. Legend had become truth. To the faithful, the Colosseum was the great altar of sacrifice, where the faith had been tested in fire and blood. The popes seized upon this image. In an age when Catholic Rome was reasserting its power against Protestant reformers, symbols mattered. The Colosseum, scarred and mighty, could be rebranded not as a pagan ruin, but as a Christian shrine. What had once stood for cruelty could now stand for redemption. In 1675, Pope Clement X declared the Colosseum sanctified by the blood of martyrs. Crosses were erected inside. Pilgrims were encouraged to visit not to gape at ruins, but to pray where the faithful had supposedly died. The church, which had once carted away its stones, now draped it in holiness. By the 18th century, devotion deepened. Pope Benedict XIV in 1749 consecrated the entire structure to the Passion of Christ. He forbade further quarrying, declaring the ruin holy and untouchable. For the first time in centuries, the Colosseum was no longer prey for chisels and wagons. Its destruction slowed because it had been reimagined as sacred. The church went further still. Stations of the cross were installed around the arena, allowing pilgrims to walk the path of Christ's suffering while tracing the outline of Rome's greatest ruin. A massive cross was planted in the centre, visible to all who entered. What had once been the emperor's stage became, in Christian eyes, the stage of Calvary. Imagine the sight. Pilgrims from across Europe, weary from long journeys, knelt on broken stones where gladiators once fought. Their prayers rose into arches that had once shaken with applause. In the silence of ruin, they envisioned martyrs serenely facing lions, their hymns rising above the roar of beasts. To them, the Colosseum was proof of God's triumph. The empire that had tried to kill the faith was dust, but the faith itself endured. The symbolism was irresistible. The amphitheater's very ruin seemed to testify to divine justice. Rome had poured blood into the sand, but God had reclaimed it. The Colosseum stood broken while the church stood strong. To walk among its arches was to walk through a sermon written in stone. Artists and poets joined in the reimagining. Painters depicted early Christians kneeling calmly before beasts, their faces lit with holy light, while Romans jeered in shadow. Writers described the Colosseum as a cathedral without roof or altar, consecrated by suffering. The ruin became less a reminder of pagan cruelty and more a monument to Christian endurance. This shift altered how the world saw the Colosseum. For centuries, it had been a convenient quarry, a fortress, a marketplace. Now it was untouchable, protected not by walls, but by faith. Its arches no longer belonged to masons or nobles. They belonged to pilgrims, to prayers, to memory. And yet the irony lingered. Historians knew that large-scale Christian executions likely took place elsewhere in the Circus Maximus, in smaller arenas across the empire. The Colosseum may not have been the great slaughterhouse of martyrs after all, but legend had triumphed over fact. What mattered was not the accuracy of the story, but the power of its meaning. By the 19th century, the Colosseum had become an essential stop on pilgrimages to Rome. Popes led processions there, especially during Holy Week. The Stations of the Cross winding through its ruined arches became an annual ritual. Pilgrims carried candles into its shadow, their flickering light casting halos on ancient stone. The amphitheater, once feared as a haunt of ghosts, now glowed as a beacon of faith. For ordinary Romans, the transformation was profound. The building they had once stripped for stone and iron was now guarded as holy. No longer could anyone quarry its blocks with impunity. The ruin was safe not because it was ancient, but because it was sacred. Thus, the Colosseum survived another chapter of its long life. It had been a theatre of empire, a machine of slaughter, a quarry, a fortress, a slum. Now it became a shrine. Its arches still whispered of blood, but the church declared that blood sanctified. Its silence was no longer haunted. It was holy. The cross planted within its arena still stands today, a reminder of that shift. Tourists see it now as a curiosity, but to the pilgrims of the 17th and 18th centuries, it was the proof of redemption. Where once Rome had mocked mercy, now the Colosseum proclaimed it. Where once Rome had staged cruelty, now it staged faith. The ruin had been rewritten again, and in that rewriting lay its survival. For each time the Colosseum was reimagined, it endured another century. The amphitheater was never frozen in one identity. It adapted from arena to shrine, from empire to Christendom, and always it remained. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Colosseum had become something new, a destination not only for pilgrims of faith, but for pilgrims of imagination. For centuries, it had been quarried, fortified, inhabited, and sanctified. Now it became a ruin to be contemplated, a mirror in which travellers saw both the grandeur of antiquity and the fragility of human ambition. This was the era of the Grand Tour. Wealthy young men from England, France, and across Europe were sent to Italy as a finishing touch to their education. Rome was their crown jewel, and the Colosseum, half broken yet immense, was the centerpiece. Guidebooks of the day insisted no tour of Rome was complete without standing inside its arches. To gaze upon it was to learn history not from books, but from stone. For these travellers, the Colosseum was not simply a ruin, it was an experience. By daylight, they marvelled at its vastness, the way its arches layered upward in elegant tiers, the way its ellipse seemed endless, the way weeds and wildflowers clung stubbornly to its cracks. By moonlight, it became something else entirely, a haunted cathedral of silence bathed in silver light, where owls stirred and shadows seemed to breathe. Countless accounts describe visitors shivering as they walked its corridors at night, certain they heard echoes of ancient cheers and screams. Poets and painters transformed the ruin into legend. Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe, Shelley Goethe, and countless others wrote of its melancholy beauty. To them, the Colosseum was a stage for the imagination where the grandeur of Rome and the inevitability of decay collided in perfect harmony. Artists sketched its broken arches, sometimes exaggerating their collapse to make the ruin appear even more sublime. Painters bathed it in moonlight or storms transforming stone into symbol. For the Romantics, the Colosseum embodied the very essence of the sublime, that mingling of beauty and terror that made the soul tremble. To stand within it was to feel both awe and dread. Awe at its size, its endurance, its memory of empire. Dread at its silence, its scars, its reminder that all empires fall, all glory fades, all monuments crumble. It was both beautiful and terrible, and thus irresistible. Pilgrims of faith also continued to flock there. They knelt at the stations of the cross, kissed the central cross planted in the arena, and whispered prayers for the martyrs they believed had perished there. For them, the ruin was not just Rome's past, but the Church's triumph. In the same space, therefore, two kinds of pilgrims met: those who sought holiness and those who sought inspiration. Both found it. Local Romans, meanwhile, adapted to the new attention. Vendors set up near the ruin to sell trinkets, food, and souvenirs to visitors. Guides offered tours recounting tales of gladiators and martyrs, often blending fact with legend to satisfy their guests. The Colosseum became not only a ruin, but an economy its stones no longer carted away, but its story now sold. One curious feature that fascinated visitors was the vegetation. For centuries, seeds carried by winds, birds, and travellers had lodged in the cracks of the Colosseum. Over time, a miniature ecosystem grew on its walls. By the 18th century, scholars catalogued over 400 species of plants sprouting from its arches, some exotic brought accidentally from distant lands. To walk around the ruin was to see not only stone, but wildflowers, grass and shrubs, turning the amphitheater into a hanging garden of history. To many, this mingling of nature and ruin symbolized the passage of time, life reclaiming what empire had abandoned. The Colosseum also inspired a sense of moral reflection. Many travelers wrote that standing in its shadow made them feel small, humbled by the weight of history. Some confessed that it stirred unease, as if the ghosts of the slaughtered still lingered. Others claimed that its silence was louder than any sermon teaching the lesson that power is fleeting, but memory endures. Painters captured this duality in canvases that circulated across Europe. Some showed peasants grazing goats in the arena, daily life mingling with grandeur. Others depicted the ruin under stormy skies, lightning flashing behind its arches, the amphitheater cast as a brooding titan. These images thrilled audiences back home, who saw in the Colosseum not only the ruin of Rome, but the ruin of all human ambition magnified into art. The ruin also became a symbol of Rome itself. Guidebooks often declared, "As long as the Colosseum stands, Rome shall stand. When the Colosseum falls, Rome will fall. When Rome falls, the world will end." Whether apocryphal or not, the saying captured the ruin's weight in the imagination. To contemplate the Colosseum was to contemplate civilization itself, its rise, its glory, its collapse. Thus, by the 18th and 19th centuries, the Colosseum had become more than stone. It was a stage for pilgrims of every kind: the devout who saw it as holy ground, the poet who saw it as inspiration, the tourist who saw it as marvel, the artist who saw it as muse. It was no longer simply a ruin of Rome. It was the world's ruin belonging to all who dreamed of empire, beauty, and time. And yet beneath the awe, the ruin still served ordinary Romans. Its arches still sheltered poor families. Its corridors still hosted workshops. To locals, it was not just a sublime relic or a holy shrine. It was home, market, and shelter. The Colosseum could be both at once a place of grandeur for the traveller and a place of survival for the resident. In this duality lay its strange genius. The Colosseum was always both glory and ruin, past and present, symbol and shelter. To pilgrims, it was the ultimate ruin. To Romans, it was simply part of daily life. And so once again, the amphitheater adapted, becoming what each age required. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Colosseum stood as one of the most recognizable ruins in the world. No longer stripped for stone, no longer fortified by nobles, no longer inhabited by bakers or blacksmiths, it had entered a new life as muse. For the Romantics, the Colosseum was not simply a ruin to study. It was a ruin to feel. The Romantic era was obsessed with the sublime, that strange fusion of beauty and terror that stirred the soul into awe. And few sights embodied the sublime like the Colosseum. Its arches, half broken, framed the sky like ribs of a fallen giant. Its sheer size dwarfed visitors, while its scars reminded them of centuries of decay. It was at once magnificent and melancholy, glorious and tragic. Poets flocked to it. Byron walked its corridors by moonlight, calling it the Gladiators' bloody circus. Shelley wrote of its silence, comparing it to a dream of eternity. Goethe stood within its arches and declared it a symbol of the inevitable fall of empires. For these writers, the Colosseum was not only Rome's ruin, but a mirror of the human condition. To gaze upon it was to confront mortality, ambition, and time itself. Painters too made it their subject. Canvases across Europe glowed with images of the Colosseum bathed in dawn light or looming under stormy skies. Some depicted it romantically overgrown with ivy and wildflowers softening its broken arches. Others exaggerated its decay, showing vast sections crumbling into shadow. Each painting was less about accuracy than emotion. The ruin as symbol, as mood, as story. Travellers on the Grand Tour carried these impressions home. A sketch of the Colosseum became proof of education, refinement and taste. To have stood inside its arches was to have touched history directly. Many returned with not just drawings, but words of awe, descriptions of moonlit silence of crickets, chirping in the weeds of candlelit processions, echoing through its corridors. These accounts fed Europe's fascination, making the ruin not just Roman, but universal. At the same time, archaeology was awakening. The 19th century was the age of excavation, when ruins were no longer just poetic backdrops, but scientific puzzles. Scholars began to clear centuries of debris from the Colosseum's arena, exposing the labyrinth of tunnels and cages below. What had once been hidden was revealed the hypogeum, the underground machinery of spectacle. Tourists who had once imagined only gladiators and lions now saw the backstage of death, the pulleys and lifts that made cruelty theatrical. This marriage of poetry and science gave the Colosseum a double life. To the romantic, it was symbol. To the archaeologist, it was evidence. Both perspectives deepened its hold on the imagination. The ruin was no longer just a fragment of the past. It was a key to understanding both history and humanity. Nationalism also claimed it. As Italy moved toward unification in the 19th century, the Colosseum became a banner for identity. To Italians, it was proof of Rome's greatness, a reminder that their land had once ruled the world. The ruin, half broken yet still mighty, symbolized resilience. Political speeches invoked it, poems celebrated it, and patriots swore that just as the Colosseum had endured, so too would Italy rise. Tourism too swelled. Railways brought visitors more easily than ever before. Guidebooks made the Colosseum a must-see. Engravings sold as souvenirs spread its image across Europe and America. By mid-century, the ruin had become not only a romantic icon, but a commercial one. Its arches endlessly reproduced its story, endlessly told. There was a darker side to this fascination. Some visitors sought relics, chipping away pieces of stone or marble as keepsakes. Others carved their names into its walls, leaving scars of vanity among scars of history. Preservationists decried the damage, but the hunger for possession was strong. To take a fragment of the Colosseum home was for some to own a piece of eternity. The church continued to sanctify it, maintaining the Stations of the Cross and leading Good Friday processions through its arena. Pilgrims walked the same corridors that poets admired. For them, the ruin was holy not because of its grandeur, but because of its suffering. The Colosseum was both cathedral and corpse, both relic and ruin. And through it all, the ruin endured. By the late 19th century, it had become one of the most photographed, painted and described monuments in the world. Its image adorned prints, postcards and illustrated books. Writers spoke of it as a universal symbol of fallen greatness painters, as the perfect muse of melancholy archaeologists, as the crown jewel of ancient engineering. The Colosseum had survived another transformation. It was no longer an amphitheater, a quarry, a fortress or a slum. It was now an icon of empire, of decay, of eternity. It belonged as much to the imagination as to the city. It had become a ruin not of Rome alone, but of the world, a mirror in which every generation saw its own fears and hopes. If you had stood in the Colosseum in the 19th century, you would have seen not gladiators, nor peasants, nor nobles. You would have seen tourists sketching poets, sighing, archaeologists digging, priests praying. The amphitheater was now a stage of memory where history and imagination performed together. The Romantics called it sublime. The archaeologists called it monumental. The nationalists called it eternal. All were right. The Colosseum was no longer simply stone. It was symbol broken, beautiful, enduring. By the 19th century, the Colosseum had been everything amphitheater, slaughterhouse, quarry fortress, marketplace, shrine, and romantic muse. But its story was not finished. As the modern world awoke, the ruin entered a new life, not as a stage of empire or a symbol of poetry, but as a monument to be preserved. The Colosseum, once consumed, stripped, and ignored, became something unprecedented, protected. The shift began slowly. Enlightenment scholars had already warned of the ruin's fragility. Romantic poets sighed over its beauty, but preservationists worried over its collapse. Each earthquake loosened more stone. Each tourist chipped away souvenirs. Each weed dug roots deeper into its mortar. By the early 1800s, the Colosseum teetered between survival and destruction. Without intervention, it might not endure another century. The papacy still ruling Rome at the time acted first. In 1803, Pope Pius VII ordered the first great stabilisation project. Massive brick buttresses were built against the most unstable sections, propping up the ancient arches like crutches for a wounded giant. To modernise, the brickwork looks out of place, red and blunt against pale travertine, but it was a lifeline. Without it, the Colosseum might have collapsed altogether. Other popes followed. Pius IX in the mid-19th century ordered further reinforcement, clearing debris from the arena floor and restoring parts of the outer wall. His vision was not just practical, but symbolic. The Colosseum should stand not as a ruin of pagan cruelty, but as a testament to Christian endurance. The large cross planted in the centre was renewed, and pilgrims continued to gather for prayers. The amphitheater was not only preserved, but moralised, reshaped as both relic and sermon. At the same time, archaeology expanded. Excavations in the late 19th century uncovered the hypogeum, the subterranean maze of tunnels and cages hidden for centuries beneath the arena floor. Tourists marvelled at the ingenuity. Elevators, trapdoors, ramps, all the machinery that had made Rome's spectacles possible. The ruin was no longer just a symbol of decay. It was also a textbook of engineering, a laboratory of ancient invention. The newly unified Italian state after 1870 claimed the Colosseum as a national monument. No longer merely the church's shrine or the poet's muse, it became the people's heritage. The Italian government funded restorations, cleared vegetation, and regulated access. For the first time in centuries, the Colosseum was no longer prey to masons and scavengers. It was protected by law. Tourism transformed it further. By the late 19th century, guidebooks hailed it as the must-see of Rome. Photographs circulated worldwide. Souvenirs multiplied. The Colosseum became not only a ruin, but an industry, the cornerstone of a modern economy of heritage. Its arches, once filled with lions and gladiators, now framed tourists with cameras and sketchbooks. The 20th century deepened preservation. Archaeologists carefully stabilised walls, mapped the hypogeum, and reconstructed partial stairways to allow visitors to wander safely. Weeds were cleared, railings, installed, signage added. The ruin, once wild and dangerous, became curated. It was now both museum and monument, inviting the world to walk its corridors without fear of collapse. But preservation was not only practical, it was also symbolic. Mussolini, eager to cloak his fascist regime in imperial grandeur, staged rallies near the Colosseum in the 1930s. To him, it was proof that modern Italy was heir to ancient Rome. He had the Via dei Fori Imperiali, built a grand avenue leading directly from his office to the amphitheater, forcing modern power to walk in the shadow of ancient might. The Colosseum thus became not just a monument to the past, but a prop for modern politics. World War II brought danger but little damage. Bombs fell near Rome, but the Colosseum survived scarred but unbroken. In the post-war years, it became a universal symbol no longer of empire or church or nation alone, but of shared heritage. UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site in 1980. Italy invested heavily in its conservation. Engineers stabilised foundations, replaced crumbling mortar, and installed modern protections against pollution and vibration from traffic. Today, the Colosseum is one of the most visited monuments on Earth, drawing millions of travellers each year. Its arches no longer shelter peasants, nobles or martyrs, but tourists from every corner of the world. Guided tours lead visitors through the hypogeum, the stands, the arena floor. Lights illuminate its arches at night, turning it into a glowing beacon in the Roman sky. It is both ruin and spectacle, once again not of death but of history. And yet, the Colosseum's preservation has not stripped away its mystery. Stand in its arena and you still feel the weight of centuries pressing down. You imagine lions pacing in the dark, gladiators breathing heavily before stepping into the sun, emperors raising their hands in judgment. Walk its corridors and the ghosts walk with you. Soldiers, slaves, pilgrims, poets. Preservation has saved the stone, but the stories still whisper in the air. What makes the Colosseum extraordinary is not only that it survives, but that it survives by changing. Each age rewrote its meaning. To the Romans, it was empire. To the Christians, martyrdom. To the medievals, quarry and fortress. To the romantics, symbol and muse. To us, it is heritage preserved for all humanity. In each guise, it endured. That endurance is its truest story. The age of preservation has not frozen the Colosseum in time. It has ensured that it continues to live not as a relic to be pitied, but as a monument to be shared. Its stones no longer belong to emperors, popes, or nobles. They belong to the world. And so the Colosseum stands once more scarred, patched, reinforced but still defiant, an ancient voice preserved for modern ears. If every city has a face, Rome's is the Colosseum. By the modern age, the amphitheater had shifted from ruin and relic to symbol. It was no longer merely a place to visit, nor simply a site to preserve. It had become an icon not only of Rome's past, but of its very identity. For centuries, Rome had been represented by many monuments: the Dome of St. Peter's, the columns of the Forum, the Pantheon's Rotunda. Yet none carried the weight. The recognition, the universal language of the Colosseum. It was the one structure that seemed to speak instantly across cultures and centuries of Rome itself. Part of this was sheer visibility. The Colosseum's silhouette with its elliptical tiers of arches is unlike anything else in the world. It is at once broken and complete, instantly recognizable, even in fragment. A child in Tokyo or New York who has never set foot in Italy can look at its image and say, Rome. Postcards, guidebooks, paintings, and now digital screens carried its outline everywhere. The amphitheater became less a ruin of stone than a symbol of place. It was also a symbol of endurance. Rome had fallen, rebuilt, fallen again. Empires had come and gone. Popes had risen and died. Wars had scarred the land. Yet through it all, the Colosseum still stood. It may have lost half its body, but it had not lost its voice. For Italians, this endurance was more than survival. It was a metaphor for their nation, scarred, battered, yet unbroken. Nationalist leaders of the 19th and early 20th centuries seized upon this. As Italy fought for unification, patriots invoked the Colosseum as proof that Italy had always been great and would be great again. To them, it was not just Roman but Italian, not just ancient, but eternal. In the amphitheater's endurance, they found inspiration for their own cause. Even Mussolini in the 1930s exploited it. He staged parades and speeches in its shadow, presenting himself as heir to the Caesars. Photographs of the Colosseum loomed behind his propaganda linking fascism to empire. The ruin became a political backdrop, its arches unwillingly pressed into service for modern ambition. And yet, even Mussolini could not control its meaning fully. For ordinary Italians, and for visitors alike, the Colosseum was larger than politics. It belonged to history, not to any regime. Tourism in the 20th century made the symbol global. As railways, cars and planes brought more travellers to Rome, the Colosseum became the must-see, the proof of arrival. Photographs of smiling families in front of its arches filled albums worldwide. It was no longer only for scholars or poets, but for everyone. The world carried the Colosseum home in snapshots, snow globes, postcards, and later keychains and magnets. Its arches adorned travel posters, airline ads, and movies. To see the Colosseum was to see Rome. To see Rome was to see the Colosseum. But the amphitheater's symbolism went deeper than tourism. It became a moral emblem as well. In the 20th century, popes used it to speak against violence and injustice. John Paul II began the tradition of leading the Good Friday Way of the Cross procession at the Colosseum, turning it into a global broadcast of faith and peace. The arena where thousands once died for spectacle became a pulpit where millions watched prayers for mercy. Modern Italians also embraced it as a symbol of resilience. When Rome suffered bombings during World War II, photographs of the Colosseum still standing reassured the world that the city had survived. When Italy emerged into the modern age, the ruin was used in art advertising and film to represent continuity, the unbroken thread linking the past to the present. Filmmakers cemented its place in the modern imagination. Epics like Ben-Hur and Gladiator revived the Colosseum as the stage of ancient drama, blending history and myth for new audiences. Tourists came not only to see a ruin, but to step into the worlds they had watched on screen. The amphitheater became both historical site and cinematic legend, living simultaneously in the past and in Hollywood's imagination. The Colosseum also became a global symbol of heritage. UNESCO listed it as a World Heritage Site in 1980, and it was voted one of the new 7 wonders of the world in 2007. Its image now circulates alongside the pyramids, the Great Wall, and Machu Picchu as one of humanity's greatest achievements. For many, it is less a Roman monument than a human one, proof of what civilization can build and what it can outlast. Walk near it today and you see this symbolism everywhere. Its outline graces Italian coins, stamps, and government emblems. Souvenirs in every shape, glass, ceramic, plastic reproduce its arches endlessly. Airlines use it to sell flights. Hotels use it to sell rooms. Chefs use it to brand menus. The Colosseum, once built to house 50,000 Romans, now sells Rome itself to millions worldwide. And yet for all this commodification, the symbol has not grown empty. Stand inside the Colosseum and the sheer weight of stone and silence cuts through every cliché. You realize why it became an icon. It is not just a ruin, it is a presence. Its arches frame not only the sky but the centuries. Its silence is louder than any speech, its endurance greater than any slogan. In the end, the Colosseum became the symbol of Rome, not because it was whole, but because it was broken. Its scars made it human, its endurance made it eternal. It embodies the paradox of Rome itself, fallen yet everlasting, wounded yet magnificent, ruinous yet glorious. As long as the Colosseum stands, Rome shall stand. And as long as Rome stands, the world will remember. The Colosseum's story does not end in marble or mortar. It continues in memory, in imagination, in the shadows it casts over history and the light it still reflects today. To walk its corridors is to step not only into Rome's past, but into humanity's deepest questions. Why do we build? Why do we destroy? And why do some monuments outlast the hands that raised them? From its birth in the 1st century to its scars in the 21st, the Colosseum has been both stage and witness. It has held emperors and beggars, martyrs and merchants, popes and pilgrims, goats and gladiators. Each generation carved its presence into the amphitheater, some with chisels, some with prayers, some with theft, and some with awe. The building became a canvas for human behaviour, noble and brutal alike. Its legacy is paradoxical. On one hand, the Colosseum was a theatre of cruelty, a place where thousands met their deaths for spectacle. On the other, it became a shrine, a symbol of endurance, even a source of inspiration for justice and peace. The same walls that once echoed with screams now echo with hymns. The same stones that once bound prisoners now bear crosses. In this contradiction lies its haunting power. Every ruin speaks, but the Colosseum shouts. Its half-body reminds us that perfection is temporary, that glory is fragile. Earthquakes toppled at looters, stripped at rulers, repurposed it. Yet still something remained. It stands not as the monument Rome wanted, but as the monument time allowed. Its missing half is as eloquent as its surviving arches. Together they form a truth. All empires crumble, but some stones endure. The amphitheater's shadow reaches far beyond Rome. Architects study its bones, marveling at concrete so strong it defied centuries. Engineers trace the systems of corridors and trapdoors, admiring Roman ingenuity. Artists sketch its arches at dawn, capturing how ruin becomes beauty. Writers summon it as metaphor, comparing nations and lives to its grandeur and decline. The Colosseum has left Rome in spirit and entered the world's imagination. It also lingers in our language. To call something colossal is to invoke its scale. The word itself is a shadow of the amphitheater, proof that the ruin has seeped into thought as much as into stone. Every time we describe something as vast, overwhelming, monumental, we echo the Colosseum. It is not only a place, it is an idea. Tourists today wander its arches with cameras, listening to guides explain bloodbread and circuses. Children peer into the arena floor, imagining lions. Couples pose against the ancient curve, hoping to freeze a fragment of eternity in a photograph. The Colosseum absorbs all of this without protest. It has hosted greater dramas than selfie sticks. Yet even in this modern bustle, silence waits. Step away from the crowd, stand beneath a half-collapsed arch, and you feel the weight of centuries pressing close. At night, the Colosseum transforms. Lights glow along its arches, shadows deepen inside its core, and the city hums around it. Cars rush past, phones buzz. Music spills from cafes, and yet above it all, the ruin looms calm and immovable. It is Rome's night watchman, the eternal witness. The city changes, but the Colosseum remains. Its legacy is not only endurance, but warning. The amphitheater shows us what happens when spectacle becomes obsession, when entertainment outweighs compassion. The blood in its sand is a reminder of humanity's darker appetites. Yet it also shows the possibility of transformation. The place once devoted to cruelty now hosts prayers for peace. Ruins teach us that meaning can shift, that shadows can soften into light. For Rome itself, the Colosseum is a heartbeat. Italians walk past it daily, sometimes scarcely noticing. Yet when earthquakes shake or restoration scaffolds rise, the city pauses. Its ruin is not only history, but identity, a mirror of Rome's resilience. For the world too, the Colosseum is more than stone. It is proof that beauty and brutality can inhabit the same walls, that the human story is never simple, that even ruins can inspire. One cannot help but imagine the future. Centuries from now, when new empires have risen and fallen, will the Colosseum still stand? Perhaps half of what we see today will be gone. Perhaps only fragments will remain swallowed by grass and sky. Or perhaps preservation will keep its arches upright, a skeleton of memory for visitors not yet born. Either way, its legacy will not vanish. It is already too deeply written into the world's imagination. To walk away from the Colosseum is to carry part of it with you. The silence of its arches lingers in the ear. The curve of its shadow follows you through streets. Its endurance becomes your companion, whispering that nothing lasts forever, but some things last long enough to matter. The Colosseum began as spectacle. It became ruin quarry, shrine fortress icon. Now it lives as symbol and shadow, belonging to no emperor, no pope, no nation. It belongs to time itself. Its stones are history's syllables. Its arches are memory's windows. Its shadow is the reminder that greatness is fragile and that fragility can be magnificent. In the end, the Colosseum is not only Rome's legacy, it is ours. Humanity built it, used it, broke it, repurposed it, revered it, and preserved it. It stands as testimony to all that we are capable of: cruelty and creativity, destruction and devotion, vanity and vision. The Colosseum is both monument and mirror. Look into it and you see not only Rome, but yourself. And so beneath the Roman sky, where moonlight drapes over arches and wind sighs through broken corridors, the Colosseum waits. Not for emperors, not for lions, not for gladiators. It waits for us, for every pilgrim, every traveller, every dreamer who enters its shadow and leaves changed. That is its true legacy, not stone, not shadow, but the transformation it sparks in those who dare to listen.